If you are in your 30s or 40s and you feel a little ashamed every time somebody younger talks about investing, I want to take that shame away from you before I do anything else. I want to do it because shame is expensive. It is more expensive than bad funds, more expensive than a bad year in the market, more expensive than paying a little too much tax. It freezes people at the exact age when they finally have the financial power to change their life. I have watched people stare at their own future as if they were already disqualified from it. They tell themselves the same tired story. I should have started at 22. I should have bought more index funds. I should have taken compounding seriously earlier. I missed the boat. I wasted a decade. Now I am too late. That story sounds intelligent because it uses the language of mathematics, but it is built on a misunderstanding of mathematics. Time matters, yes. Compounding matters, yes. Starting early is useful, yes. But none of those things operate in a vacuum. They operate on contributions, they operate on surplus. They operate on a human being who either has room to invest or does not, and most people in their 20s do not have nearly as much room as the internet pretends they do. That is the first thing I want you to see. A small contribution made early is better than nothing, but the world has romanticized the age of starting and ignored the age of acceleration. Most people do not build serious wealth when they first become old enough to invest. They build serious wealth when their financial engine finally develops enough thrust to break free from survival. That is why I want to give you one idea and hold on to it all the way through this conversation. Wealth is not mainly built by starting earliest. Wealth is built by reaching escape velocity. Everything I am going to show you sits inside that one line. If you do not understand escape velocity, let me put it simply. A rocket does not leave the Earth because it politely points upward. It leaves because it produces enough force to overcome gravity. Before that moment, every bit of energy is being spent fighting the pull that keeps it stuck near the ground. Your financial life works the same way. In your 20s, for most people, gravity is brutal. Rent, student loans, transport, rising food bills, social expectations, weddings, moving costs, deposits, uncertainty, low earnings, weak margins. The constant feeling that life is more expensive than your salary spreadsheet suggested it would be. People call that irresponsibility after the fact. I call it gravity. And if you spent your 20s trying to get established, trying to stay above water, trying to build a career, trying to create a household, trying to save for a deposit, trying to feel like an adult without breaking apart financially, that was not some moral failure. That was your launchpad years. That was not the mission failing. That was fuel being loaded while gravity was still strongest. The tragedy is not that people spent their 20s in the warm-up. The tragedy is that they arrive at the age when they finally have thrust and still behave as if the countdown already ended. I want to fix that. Because the best decade to build wealth is not always the earliest decade. Very often it is the first decade in which your income, your behavior, your tax position, and your psychological seriousness all begin pulling in the same direction. That usually happens later than the influencers want to admit. A 23-year-old can have the right philosophy and still not have enough financial force to do much with it. A 36-year-old can start from zero, and if the structure is right, outrun the person who started earlier but never reached escape velocity with real contributions. People hate that idea because it sounds like a violation of compounding. It is not. Compounding amplifies what you can feed it. If you spend 10 extra years contributing tiny sums while your actual financial life is still pinned down by gravity, you have gained time, yes, but not nearly as much usable power as people imagine. If you begin later with much larger, much more tax efficient, much more consistent contributions, time has less to work with, but capital has far more force behind it. That is the math almost nobody explains honestly. So let me give names to the forces that actually matter. The first one is survival gravity. This is the invisible tax your 20s place on almost everyone. I am not talking about government tax. I am talking about the sheer drag of early adult life. A person earning an ordinary salary in their 20s often has almost no serious margin after basic life is paid for. Not in fantasy, in real life. People online love to show you a neat chart. Invest $500 a month from 21. Do that for 4 decades. End up rich. What they quietly smuggle into that chart is the assumption that $500 a month was genuinely available in the first place. For many people it was not. Maybe they had 50 left, maybe 100 on their best month, maybe some months it was nothing, maybe they were setting up their home, paying rent, replacing a car, covering travel to work, rebuilding after a breakup, moving cities, helping family, or clawing their way toward a deposit. That is not evidence that they are unserious. That is evidence that gravity was heavy. A person on a modest income can build a good habit in those years. I respect that enormously. But a habit is not the same thing as escape velocity. A tiny monthly amount teaches discipline. It does not automatically create transformative wealth. The internet keeps collapsing those two ideas together and then making ordinary adults feel guilty when their 20s looked like ordinary adulthood. I do not want guilt. I want precision. The question is not whether early habits are good. The question is when your life finally creates enough surplus to matter at scale. That brings me to the second mechanism. I call it the surplus gap. This is one of the most important numbers in your entire life, and most people never measure it with enough seriousness. The surplus gap is the distance between what life actually cost you and what you now earn after your earning power starts to mature. When you are early in your career, the gap is usually thin. Income goes up a little, but most of it is still swallowed by necessity. When your career matures, something changes. Your earnings can rise materially, but your basic living costs do not always rise in lockstep. That gap is where wealth begins. You do not get rich because income rises in an abstract sense. You get rich because your investable surplus stops arriving through a dripping tap and starts arriving through a pipe. That is a different game. Imagine 2 identical containers. Into one, water falls drop by drop. Into the other, water arrives through a hose. If you stare only at time, you will say the first container had a huge advantage because it started earlier. But if you pay attention to flow, you begin to understand reality. Enough flow over a shorter period can beat a long period of weak flow. That is why your 30s and 40s are so often decisive. They are the years when many people first gain a surplus large enough to feed real compounding. Not motivational compounding, actual compounding. The kind built on 500, 800, 1,000 or more per month instead of occasional crumbs. The kind where tax wrappers matter because there is now enough money to use them. The kind where one good decision repeated for 10 or 15 years changes the entire back half of your life. That is escape velocity, but higher earnings alone do not save anyone. I have seen salary growth ruin just as many people as it rescues. Why? Because income can rise while behavior stays juvenile, the rocket gets a bigger engine, but the fuel keeps leaking out the sides. So the third mechanism matters just as much. I call it the great calming. One of the great advantages of getting older is not just that you earn more. It is that you often stop trying to impress the wrong audience in youth. A lot of spending has emotion hiding inside it. Belonging comparison, insecurity, identity, reward, boredom, image management, the desire to look successful before you have actually built the underlying balance sheet. That is expensive. It is expensive, not only because of what you buy, but because it teaches your nervous system to treat money as a tool for social camouflage instead of strategic freedom. Then something shifts. You get into your 30s, maybe your late 30s, maybe your 40s, and the performance starts to feel stale. You care less about appearing impressive and more about becoming safe. You care less about the weekend signal and more about the decade outcome. You care less about displaying success and more about owning time. That is the great calming. And do not underestimate how valuable that is. A calmer person is an investable person. A calmer person can automate. A calmer person can hold. A calmer person can say no. A calmer person can survive market noise without redesigning their life every 6 weeks. A calmer person can build what younger people admire later, but are rarely patient enough to construct. This is where the identity shift begins. Most people think the shift they need is from spender to saver. That is too small. The real shift is from worker to allocator. When you live only as a worker, every month is about labor, bills, fatigue, and recovery. Money comes in, life pulls it apart. Next month begins. There is no real strategic layer. You are surviving inside the machine. When you become an allocator, something fundamental changes. Your salary is no longer just your means of consumption. It becomes raw material. You begin directing capital instead of merely receiving pay. You stop asking, what can I buy with this month? And start asking, what system can this month fund? That is the identity flip most people never name clearly enough. You are not trying to become a more disciplined shopper. You are trying to become a person who converts earned income into permanent refusal power. That takes us to the fourth mechanism. I call it the tax rescue engine. This is where adulthood becomes financially unfair in your favor, if you know what you are doing. When your income rises into higher tax territory, every badly directed pound becomes more painful, but every well-directed pound becomes more powerful. Many people see higher income and think only of higher tax. I see higher income and think of optionality, wrappers, and routing. If you are earning enough to sacrifice salary into a pension efficiently, that is not a boring administrative decision. That is a force multiplier. A pound that would have been mauled by tax can be redirected into ownership. A pound that would have dissolved into the state can be rescued into your future. People hear the word pension and immediately think about delay restriction, old age, and waiting. They miss the real point. The pension is not merely an account. It is a tax rescue engine. When your income is high enough, the government is effectively standing beside you asking whether you want to surrender a large slice of certain earnings or redirect more of them into capital formation. If you ignore that choice, you are not being casual. You are walking past one of the strongest legal wealth building tools available to ordinary professionals. And when you use salary sacrifice or any efficient higher rate relief structure properly, you are not just saving. You are buying assets with money that suffered less damage on the way in. That matters enormously over time. If a person contributes the same nominal amount but one route loses more to tax friction before the money even reaches the portfolio, the eventual difference is huge. Not because one person was more brilliant, because one person understood routing. That is what adults with real income can finally exploit in a serious way. Then comes the fifth mechanism. I call it the dual runway. One reason people stay trapped is that they think wealth is a single account problem. It is not. A serious life usually needs two kinds of runway. One runway is for later life. One runway is for freedom before later life. That is why relying on pension alone is incomplete. Yes, it may be the most powerful long-term tax engine you have, but if all your capital is trapped until a later access age, you may be asset-rich and freedom-poor. You may be technically on track and still unable to leave the wrong job. Redesign your schedule, take a sabbatical, or buy back your time when your children actually know your name. So you need a second runway. That is where the ISA-type structure, or any genuinely accessible, tax-efficient investment runway becomes vital. Not because it is glamorous, because accessible capital changes behavior. It gives you choices before formal retirement age. It gives you strategic airspeed. It allows you to stop thinking in one giant distant horizon and start building intermediate freedom. One runway handles age-based compounding. The other handles life-based flexibility. Together, they form a dual engine. Now, you are no longer building toward a vague someday. You are building toward specific layers of optionality. One pool for the distant future, one pool for the years when you may want to slow down, pivot. Step back or simply stop tolerating nonsense. That is how mature wealth is built. Not by one magical investment, not by one heroic year, by designing a system that can carry both your future old age and your nearer freedom. And now we come to the arithmetic that usually changes how people feel. Let me give you a simple comparison. Suppose one person starts young and invests a relatively modest amount every month for decades. Good habit, respectable discipline, longer time horizon, everyone praises that person, and rightly so. Now suppose another person starts 10 years later after using their 20s to survive, train, relocate, build a career, and sort out the chaos that early adult life tends to bring. But when that second person starts, the monthly contribution is no longer symbolic. It is real, several times larger. It also flows through better tax structures. It is also more consistent because the person is psychologically steadier and financially less fragile. The public story says that person is behind. The math often says otherwise. Let us keep the numbers simple enough to remember. A person beginning at 25 with $250 per month, staying steady for 35 years, ends up with a decent result if markets behave reasonably. That is a real achievement. But a person beginning at 35 with $800 per month for 25 years can end with materially more money despite having less time. Increase that contribution further through intelligent tax routing, and the gap can widen again. The lesson is not that time is overrated. The lesson is that contribution power can overwhelm time when the difference in contribution is large enough. That is the lie your guilt has been feeding on. It told you the missing decade mattered more than the stronger decade. It told you early visibility mattered more than later force. It told you the opening scene determined the whole movie. That is not how finance works in ordinary lives. In ordinary lives, the middle years often decide everything, and that is why I want to be very careful with your psychology here. If you are 34, 38, 42, even later, and you are just beginning, the danger is not actually lateness. The danger is hesitation. The danger is spending the next 5 years mourning the previous 10. That is how people truly lose. They do not lose because they were once pinned down by gravity. They lose because once they finally had thrust, they still behaved like a person waiting for permission. Do not do that to yourself. Your age can now become an advantage if you use it correctly. You know more. You have seen your own mistakes more clearly. You are less vulnerable to fantasy. You know what an expensive habit looks like. You know what a bad relationship with money feels like. You know that appearances are usually bought on credit, one way or another. You know which comforts matter and which ones simply sedate you. You know what instability costs. That knowledge is investable. A mature person with a system beats a younger person with vague good intentions all the time. Now let me push the identity shift further, because this is where real transformation happens. I do not want you thinking of yourself as someone trying to catch up. That frame is poison. People who think they are catching up usually make one of two mistakes. They either become reckless because they want to erase time, or they become timid because they are embarrassed by time. Both are forms of insecurity. Both sabotage discipline. I want a different frame. You are not catching up. You are entering the acceleration window. That changes everything. The acceleration window is the period of life where four conditions begin to align Your earning power is higher, your self-control is better, your tax efficiency matters more. Your need for freedom is finally emotional enough to act on. That is a potent combination. A 24-year-old may understand compounding intellectually. A 40-year-old with children, work fatigue, higher tax exposure, clearer priorities, and a desire to own the next chapter of life understands freedom viscerally. And visceral understanding produces action. This is why the strongest wealth years are often deeply connected to a moral seriousness that younger people have not yet developed. It is not just about getting rich. It is about refusing future dependency. It is about refusing panic. It is about refusing to become old with no room. It is about refusing to let the market value of your labor determine the dignity of your later life. That is what real wealth is for. It is not applause. It is not internet status. It is not a screenshot. It is refusal power. The power to refuse bad work. The power to refuse humiliating trade-offs. The power to refuse panic selling. The power to refuse living forever at the mercy of monthly cash flow. The power to refuse becoming the kind of older person who must tolerate what they should have been free to reject. And that is exactly why the system matters. So let me give you the operating system plainly. First, measure your surplus gap with honesty. Not what you wish your margin was. Not what a budgeting app flatters you into believing. I mean the real number left after life. Debt obligations, basic maintenance, and unavoidable commitments. You need to know how much monthly force you can direct with consistency. Second, route the highest value pounds first. If your employer offers matching or salary-based pension efficiency, understand it properly and use it properly. These are not side details. These are structural advantages. Third, build the accessible runway alongside the locked runway. Long-term compounding is essential, but so is a pool of capital that can be reached before conventional retirement age. Do not build a future that looks rich on paper and powerless in life. Fourth, automate before motivation fades. Mature wealth is built by systems that survive your moods. If the contribution depends on inspiration, it is not a system yet. Fifth, increase contributions whenever income rises, but do not let lifestyle consume every raise. Every raise presents a fork in the road. One path converts new income into new dependency. The other converts new income into escape velocity. Most people do not become trapped by low income forever. They become trapped by upgrading their cage faster than they upgrade their capital. Sixth, attach the whole structure to a clear freedom target. Do not merely ask how big the portfolio could become. Ask what the portfolio is supposed to do. Retire earlier, work less, switch careers, protect your family, create margin, sleep without dread. If the money has no mission, behavior drifts. This is the blueprint. Nothing exotic, nothing theatrical. Just force applied in the right direction for long enough. You may notice that this entire blueprint is less glamorous than the internet promised you wealth would be. Good glamour is usually expensive. What actually changes lives is routing, surplus, automation, tax awareness, restraint, and time used correctly once serious contributions begin. That is not sexy enough for viral nonsense, but it is exactly how ordinary people build extraordinary stability. And let me say something else that matters. Do not romanticize your 20s just because you regret them. That decade is often messy for a reason. People are under-earning, over-learning, over-socialized, under-anchored, and constantly renegotiating identity. If you managed to build a little during that period, wonderful. If you did not, that alone does not convict you. Your 20s were not automatically your best wealth decade just because the formula says early is ideal. A formula with unrealistic assumptions is not wisdom. Wisdom begins with conditions as they actually are. And the conditions many of you face now are stronger than the conditions you had 10 or 15 years ago. Not perfect, stronger. That is enough. A larger contribution base, a calmer mind, a clearer sense of what matters, a stronger reason to stop drifting, a better grasp of tax friction, a willingness to build 2 runways instead of 1, a desire for refusal power instead of applause. That is enough to make this stage of life incredibly powerful. I have seen people start later and still create outcomes that would have looked impossible to their younger selves. Not because they discovered a secret stock, not because they became market geniuses, because they stopped worshiping the myth of the perfect start and began applying force where force finally mattered. That is a very different thing. If you want the sentence I would write on a card and make you carry in your wallet, it would be this: the decade you build wealth is the decade you stop leaking force. Everything follows from that. When you stop leaking force, bad routing, tax waste, unmeasured surplus, and lifestyle drift, your life begins to climb, not immediately in visible fireworks, but steadily, then unmistakably. And one day you notice something wonderful. Your portfolio is no longer just a number. It is buying back your reactions. It is softening your fear. It is reducing the number of people you need permission from. It is changing the tone of your household. It is altering the conversations you can have with yourself about the future. It is taking the pressure off every decision, because not every decision now has to be made under financial duress. That is what mature wealth feels like. It feels quieter than fantasy. It also, now I want to end where most people need to be challenged. There is a dangerous comfort in telling yourself you are too late. It sounds painful, but it secretly protects you. If you are too late, then you do not have to measure the surplus. You do not have to set the direct debit. You do not have to learn the pension rules. You do not have to confront lifestyle creep. You do not have to build the accessible runway. You do not have to become an allocator. You can sit in a story of regret and call it realism. I would not do that, because from where I sit, that is not realism. That is surrender dressed up as maturity. The real question is much harsher. Now that you are finally at an age where escape velocity is possible, what exactly will you do with that fact? Will you keep honoring a younger version of yourself who had less income, less clarity, less emotional stability, and less room? As if that earlier version already sentenced the rest of your life. Or will you sign a new contract with your future self? A contract that says the warm up is over. A contract that says guilt is finished. A contract that says every month from here forward will be routed with intent. A contract that says raises will not be wasted. A contract that says tax will not be overpaid through laziness. A contract that says accessible freedom matters, not just distant retirement. A contract that says I am no longer a worker consuming my income, but an allocator directing force. That is the threshold. Cross it and your 30s or 40s stop being the decade you apologized for. They become the decade that changed everything. Ignore it, and the cost will not merely be a smaller portfolio. The real cost will be that you reached the runway and never took off. And if that happens, you will not be angry at your 20s. You will be angry at the years when you finally had the power to move and chose not to use it. That is the mirror. Look into it carefully. You do not need an earlier life. You need a cleaner system. You need stronger routing. You need fewer leaks. You need more force. You need the courage to stop calling yourself late, when what you really are is loaded with unspent potential. Escape velocity is not granted to the youngest person in the room. It is granted to the person who finally applies enough force in one direction for long enough to break free. Make that person you.